It's the end of an era, decade upon decade of collaboration between Roscosmos and the Russian Federation, and so many countries around the world is coming to an end. Japan, Britain, South Korea, the United States, many other nations, although the flag of India remains conspicuously on Russian rockets for future use, but for the most part, Roscosmos and Russia is divorcing its entire connection. Its entire history of collaboration is being flushed down the toilet, and the majority of this is as a result of Russia's decisions and not the Western world's. That is to say that even though the Western world is imposing all sorts of extreme sanctions on Russia, it is Russia that has made the decision to cut all ties with Western nations, which is truly unfortunate because this might have been the one opportunity to maintain an avenue of communication, an avenue of diplomacy between Russia and all the nations that are currently isolating it. However, that is not going to happen. And of course, this is a huge tragedy to the world. Many people may regard Roscosmos as being unimportant, a has-been, an organization that really can bring no benefit to anybody, but it's simply not the case. Russian Soyuz rockets have been deploying the OneWeb constellation. They've been involved in a variety of different scientific missions for the ESA and others, and of course, most importantly, the ExoMars mission, the European Space Agency's lander that was going to be looking for life on the surface of Mars in months, is now going to be canceled for at least another 2 years, assuming that it survives at all. But interestingly enough, Elon Musk has decided to stand alone and not ban RT transmissions over his Starlink constellation. In stark contrast to so many other ISPs throughout the Western world and indeed throughout the planet, he has decided to allow RT and all of their information, which frankly is a lot of biased Russian propaganda, to pass through his Starlink constellation and get broadcast across the planet. Why has he made this kind of decision when so many others have decided to not allow it? Why is he giving the Russians an avenue of communication to the outside world? Well, in my opinion, he's making a very good decision, and you're about to find out why in just a moment. Ever since Vladimir Putin started his unprovoked invasion of the sovereign nation of Ukraine, nations across the world, especially in the West, have been eager to pile on as far as imposing various types of punishments against the Russian Federation. And rightly so. They're doing everything they possibly can to discourage Russia from continuing with their military operations, or at the very least, if they manage to overthrow the Ukrainian government, to make the whole process so costly for them that they eventually have no choice but to return democracy to the Ukraine. One way or another, Europe intends to make this happen, but they've started to take action that some people have found to be a little questionable, especially when it comes to news agencies. YouTube has blocked access, for example, across Europe to Russia's state-funded international broadcasters such as RT, which was formerly Russia Today, and also Sputnik. And this also came in conjunction rather with sanctions against Russia by the European Commission, which saw Russia Today and Sputnik and their subsidiaries banned across the entire European Union. Now, this of course was done because these various nations are concerned that these networks are going to spread harmful disinformation about Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, which obviously they will. Russia Today and Sputnik are definitely agencies that are ciphers for the Russian government and are going to spread Russian propaganda. However, is completely banning them the right thing to do? And are we throwing free speech out the window? That is something that Elon Musk has decided is unacceptable, and that's why he made the decision to not allow this to happen across his internet network through the Starlink constellation. And there's also a question as to how RT's content varies depending on the subject matter. Obviously, they're going to be supportive of the Russian government as far as those particular issues are concerned, but did you know that RT was actually an Emmy Award nominee in 2012 for their reporting on Occupy Wall Street? Now, obviously, Occupy Wall Street is something that would serve Russia's anti-American stance, but nevertheless, RT didn't just do a biased piece on it. They actually did quality journalism that almost won them an Emmy. And it's not the only example of quality journalism that RT does. Now, this, of course, doesn't excuse some of the disinformation that RT has passed on, the most infamous of which was in 2018 when a former Russian military officer and double agent for British intelligence agencies, Sergei Skripal, and his daughter were poisoned by a deadly nerve agent in Salisbury, England. This was an incident that almost certainly was perpetrated by the Russians, but RT, of course, said otherwise. Now, this is still a situation that's under investigation, but nevertheless, RT made it very clear that they did not believe that Russia was behind it, and there were calls for RT's license to be rescinded as a result of this. So RT has been in trouble in the past, but does this justify completely banning their activities in the rest of the world? There's a matter of consistency here as well, because keep in mind, the People's Republic of China and all of their news agencies are operating without any problems whatsoever, no restrictions, and on top of that, organizations like the Syrian news agency and YouTube channels associated with Assad, all of those sorts of despicable organizations, they too operate without any restrictions. Why is RT being singled out? And there's another complication. If we want the Russian people to turn against Putin or start to become dissatisfied with the war and to learn at least a few of the facts about what's going on, it might be nice if they had access to European and Western media. And prior to all of this happening, they did at least have access to Facebook and Twitter, albeit some restrictions were placed on it, but still, it was an avenue of communication for people in the West to communicate with people in Russia. That no longer is the case. Facebook and Twitter are now completely blocked in Russia. That wasn't the other way around, by the way. It wasn't the fact that the Russians blocked access to Twitter and Facebook first, and then the West blocked access to Russia Today. We blocked access to RT, and then the Russians responded in kind. And by shutting down these avenues of communication, it also shuts down a lot of other information that I think is quite relevant. For example, Putin's crazy claims about neo-Nazism in Ukraine and all that is actually based in a tiny amount, and I'm talking a sliver, but a growing growing movement of neo-Nazi activity in Ukraine, and it's becoming more and more powerful by the day. This is the legendary Azov Regiment and another neo-Nazi organization known as C-14. Now, every country has their neo-Nazi ultra-right-wing organizations. However, it was a little disturbing for me to discover that Ukraine's Ministry of Youth and Sports awarded about $17,000 to C-14 for a children's camp. That's right, a children's camp for a neo-Nazi organization, basically a Hitler Youth organization. And this is not an isolated incident. In 2019, C-14 launched a defamation suit against an internet TV station in Ukraine called Hromadska. This particular TV station published a tweet referring to C-14 as a neo-Nazi group. The court amazingly required the news organization to retract the statement and pay a fine. Now, once again, C-14 is not just some sort of right-wing organization that has some politically incorrect views. They've openly expressed neo-Nazi views, physically attacked women's advocates, and on April 21st of 2018, they attacked a gypsy camp in Kiev's Lisa Hora Park, and this, by the way, received condemnation from Amnesty International. Quote, "We heard strong condemnatory statements from senior officials, and they committed to provide justice to the victims. But where are we a year on? What the Ukrainian authorities have done over the past 12 months falls far short of an effective investigation, and they have done little to help the victims of this brazen hate crime," unquote. Here's my point. I'm not saying that Ukraine is becoming a right-wing nation or dominated by a Nazi government or anything like that, nor am I saying that Putin is in any way justified in his attack on this country. The vast majority of the Ukrainian people are nothing like this. However, there is a growing fascist problem in Ukraine. It's something that's receiving, as I said before, at least tacit support from some elements of the Ukrainian government, and nobody in the Western media is talking about it anymore. They used to talk about it before this invasion, but now there's no discussion of it whatsoever. These organizations have attacked gypsy groups, also known as Roma, several times, along with anti-fascist demonstrations, city council meetings, an event hosted by Amnesty International, art exhibitions, LGBT events, and environmental activists. They even launched attacks against International Women's Day marchers, and only in a few of these cases did the police do anything to prevent the attacks, and in some cases they even arrested peaceful demonstrators instead of the actual perpetrators. And this is not something I got out of an RT news source. This was from AtlanticCouncil.org, a highly respected media organization. So what's my point here? That Ukraine is so fascist that Russia had to do something about it? No, absolutely not. Once again, let me emphasize, what Putin has done is completely unacceptable, an act of wanton aggression and bloodshed against a sovereign nation, and it is inexcusable. But my point is, these sorts of things actually do exist in Ukraine. There is a growing right-wing movement that is not being entirely checked by many aspects of the Ukrainian government. This was a growing problem before the Russians invaded, and now that they have invaded, nobody is discussing it. And ironically, not only is the whole Ukrainian neo-Nazi problem being completely excluded from the Western media's dialogue about the war, they're also being strengthened by it. They have been recruiting like crazy, and actually have been recruiting very strongly since 2014, when Russian breakaway republics began to cause all these troubles in the Ukraine in the first place. These organizations have been strengthened. Their whole agenda of Ukraine for Ukrainians has been perverted and twisted by right-wing white supremacist views. And by the way, if you're one of those people who are considering joining the Ukrainian militia, joining the Ukrainian military, be very, very cautious as to who you decide to join up with, because these organizations are recruiting aggressively, and Ukraine obviously needs all the soldiers they can get, so they're not going to do anything about it at the moment. I'm actually a little frightened as to what C-14 and the Azov Regiment and other organizations like them might look like after this war is over. How powerful might they be? These are one of many problems that are likely to face the Ukraine now that Putin has undertaken this idiotic, this ridiculously aggressive, bloodthirsty, and stupidly ambitious invasion. Now, are agencies like Sputnik and RT likely to tell the whole truth about how these organizations fit into the fabric of Ukrainian society and Ukrainian life? Absolutely not. No doubt they're exaggerating it and using it as a justification for this whole war. But they're not the only ones who are spreading lies, such as this picture of a girl confronting a Russian soldier supposedly, but it was actually a Palestinian girl confronting an Israeli soldier, or this picture of a French foreign legionnaire, not a Russian soldier, or this picture of a woman suffering in Syria, not in the Ukraine. And the list goes on. This image of a Russian jet supposedly being downed by Ukrainian anti-aircraft fire, but it was actually an air show accident. Or this image of Vladimir Putin announcing that he intends to move into Africa next, which was completely untrue, and the subtitles were nothing resembling what he was actually saying. And this image, I think, is the most ironic of all. An image of Kyiv during the 2014 riots that led to a change in government and began Ukraine's movement towards NATO and towards becoming part of the European Union, and began Russia's intervention. The moment that Ukraine began to move towards becoming a free and democratic society is now being used as an image to depict the chaos of war. Ironic indeed. And my whole point is the fact that falsehoods and distortions are being circulated everywhere about this war. It's difficult to tell what's true and what isn't. What is the whole story? Frankly, I don't think anybody has the whole story. Not the Western media, certainly not RT, but really nobody else either. And so why does a single news media agency need to be singled out and their freedom of speech completely cut off as a matter of national policy? And this is what Elon Musk is trying to do. The point he's trying to make, that freedom of speech, no matter how distorted, needs to be permitted, especially in the digital age where people have the freedom to say what they want to say, no matter how untrue, distorted, or flat out wrong it might be. And regardless of whether it's a governmental news agency doing it or just some random idiot posting things online, they should all have the right to say what they believe, and everyone should have the opportunity to communicate with one another as much as possible rather than sealing off those avenues of communication, which is happening right now. And this is one of the many tragedies of this war. The worst tragedy, obviously, is what's happening to the Ukrainian people. But a tragedy attached to it is what's happening with Russia, the fact that their space program is most likely to go straight down the tubes, and so is their economy, and so is their society. And that is something that will not be good for the world in the long run. I guarantee you, a nation armed with nuclear weapons going into a state of utter chaos and economic disaster is going to be a tremendous danger to the world no matter what. And finding avenues of diplomatic resolution to the problems that are currently facing us are the best way of resolving these things, not cutting off avenues of communication and muzzling people, regardless of how biased or misleading the opinions of these people might be. If we silence anybody, we become just like them, and that's something we dare not allow. So I'm with you, Elon, all the way. If you like what I have to say, if you enjoy my content, please look at the description. There are many ways to support me, or please subscribe to this channel if you want to see more content, less political content in the future, which I guarantee is coming soon. So until the world begins to recognize that we need to open avenues of communication rather than close them in order to achieve lasting peace, assuming that that thing is even remotely possible, and obviously I have my doubts about that, but until we are truly trying to achieve that end result, I urge all of you to stay angry about space.